So without further ado, let's go ahead and dig in. In our session today, we're going to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to spend most of the time today doing some architectural reviews and scenarios of a few different places where we see Azure having significant value, starting with the concept of Flux, following on the data center expansions, hybrid app development, security, governance and access, app services being mobile, media, websites, DR, and VC, and the single pane of glass that comes with System Center inside of Azure and some of the new releases with some of the new 2012 Service Pack 1 feature sets. And then we'll do a blitz with a recap of all of the FY13 changes, and that's Microsoft's fiscal year 13. So that'll be ending in the next few weeks here. And then we'll follow up with a discussion around the Nimbus framework and how that can help you understand the architecture of Azure as it relates to your business. So my name is Brian Blanchard. I'll be one of your hosts on this fun journey. I have a little over 16 years of experience in development and IT leadership, serving as a CIO, a chief architect, a variety of other roles throughout different verticals. And I've been in the cloud since before Microsoft, building the Amazon before there was an Azure, and been working in Azure since CTP was announced. Since that time, I've delivered more than 150 apps in the cloud and more than 100 of Microsoft's Azure boot camps. And because of that, Microsoft recently named me an Azure VTSP and most recently invited me to join their Azure Ranger program. And with me today, we have Nathan Reynolds and Dave Wickersham.
Hey everyone, this is Nathan Reynolds. I'm a senior consultant for Oakwood Systems Group in our systems management practice. I have over 13 years of network administration and systems management experience. Most of the network administration experience is revolved around data center automation using the System Center suite of components, and my networking and security background focuses on building resilient network environments, scalable virtual environments, and secure edge deployments.
My name's Dave Wickersham. Everybody calls me Wick. I have over 13 years of programming experience in various market segments, industries. I've been focused in on Azure for 5 years now. Basically delivered the first presentation in St. Louis on Azure. And from there I built a lot of things in Windows and other technologies. I'm also an Azure VTSP.
Thanks, guys. As you can see on the screen, there's quite a bit going on inside Azure. The blue boxes that tend to lean towards the left, the PC, the browser, the web, the worker roles, the blobs, tables, queues, and SQL Azure databases are the only things that were GA in Azure as of a year ago today. Those things in purple were either in a GA or a preview state. They were terminated as a project and rebuilt from the ground up and re-released. That includes everything from the portal to caching to service bus to AD and access control. The focus there was Microsoft wanted to build on some of the networking talent they had internally to solidify those components. And everything else you see in green has been released into Azure in the last year. The vast majority of these feature sets either have gone GA here recently or will in the next couple of days. So we're going to cover a lot of this in great depth. And starting out, we're going to walk through one of my personal favorite architectural scenarios. And this is our concept of Flux. Flux is a Oakwood-specific service offering that we bring to market. And the thought behind Flux is every one of us has some collection of on-premise applications, maybe even some mobile applications, and somewhere has a basic database structure that we're utilizing. Our employees, our partners, and our customers can all benefit from accessing that information and generally have to do so on-prem through those applications. So the first thing that we add from the cloud in the Flux program is the concept of a service bus or SOA. This allows us to actually extend those applications and those data sets beyond what we currently have and start to solidify those applications to build more of an ODS as opposed to just a single database. And Data Sync is a powerful tool in that as well because it helps us leverage those disparate data sets and very conveniently redirect all that into a central data repository. So this is an alternate approach to an ERP system. The next set of tools we look at are the EDI, APIs, website, and mobile services. These are other ways that once we have that data consolidated, we can share it back out to our partners and customers. By building simplistic APIs that we run inside the service bus or inside the SOA layer, we can safely get that data out to our partners. By wrapping that in mobile services and websites, we can get that out to our customers as well. Again, extending that thought, rather than building an ERP, building out the custom pieces we need, but keeping that data centralized in that on-premise database. The next thought is that if we're using the Service Bus or SOA or even Data Sync, we can take some of those on-prem apps and extend them, get them out of the infrastructure, and maybe expose them through a web service that has a reduced functionality set, or bring it to a mobile device so that our employees can use it off-prem. And again, use Data Sync so that we can keep that data synchronized back to our on-prem database. And the next set of tools that I like to look at are the data tools. So the reporting inside of SQL Azure, being able to get that data out and disseminate that analytics to our customers more conveniently. Or Hadoop and Stream Insight to consolidate that data, use MapReduce patterns, and turn both structured and non-structured data into a central ODS, using some persistent VMs to handle that workload. And again, bring this all together so that we have one concise view of the data that we're working with and can share that information. So the benefits of this approach predominantly is that it strengthens the relationships with our customers and let us have a tighter grained view of what our customers are doing and greater access for them to our data. We can build on our current tech, and through this approach we don't have to refactor a bunch of things or rewrite a lot of things. We're just integrating add-on tools to the apps we've already built. And it's a great way to bridge that generation gap or that work-life balance gap that a lot of our employees are looking for by getting those apps out to their mobile devices and freeing them from the desktop. And most importantly, and the thing that excites me the most, is that since we're sharing data, we can create collisions. Not head-on accidents in cars, but collisions between our employees and our partners and our customers. So it strengthens our employee relationships with people outside of the infrastructure. And this is the Flux program. This is a large approach that we implement for customers that are looking to implement something better than an ERP and go to the height of what they can do inside Windows Azure. This is a lot of tool sets and definitely isn't suggested for your first step into the water, but kind of a blue sky approach of some of the greatness that you can build with all those tool sets that we saw on the prior screens. So looking at our next approach, we're going to have Nathan Reynolds share some information about data center expansions with you.
Hey everyone. So when expanding the data center, let's walk through this scenario. So we have private cloud, and the private cloud is basically your on-premise virtual server infrastructure, and the virtual server infrastructure can be running Microsoft Hyper-V, VMware, really not concerned about the underlying virtualization layer there. And optionally, you can manage and monitor that infrastructure using Microsoft System Center components. Then we can also leverage the public cloud in creating persistent VMs using persistent storage there to provide solutions to our end customers so that they can you can extend the data center and optionally leverage those as public connection points. Using System Center and some of these solutions also allows you to migrate between clouds. So you can then provision private cloud resources out to the public cloud, capture public cloud resources, and migrate those back to the private cloud depending on your data center needs. So some of the use cases for this, connecting your private cloud to the public cloud allows you to capitalize on those investments in your data center. It also allows you to burst resources, say you have dynamic workload needs, in which case you need to provision and then later deprovision those to maximize those investments and limit some of those capital expenditures. And you can also privatize your public cloud by expanding to the public cloud whenever you need extra capacity and scalability. Now, some of the concerns that come with these solutions are things like primarily around the internet connection connecting these clouds. So you have some latency issues, sometimes stability or speed issues. So you certainly need to make sure that this is architected in a manner which allows that public cloud connection to be highly available. There's also some added VNet complexity when you're extending your private data center into the public cloud. Typically, you need to carefully architect that underlying network solution.
So one place that we see this really valuable for a lot of our current customer base, even before IS went GA, is when we talk about that line of extending the life of on-prem resources. If you've got a robust virtual network or virtualization structure built and inside of your data center internally, there's ways that we can migrate some workloads back and forth that make sense. Don't put a huge demand on your internal resources or the management structure, and can still allow you to capitalize on some of these things. A great scenario for a first step there would be your dev test environment. If you have tons of dev servers that you're standing up periodically and you're breaking them back down, we can migrate those out to the cloud, spin them up as you need from templates or straight out of your virtualized structure, and have those available as you need. And what that does is carves off a pretty big slice of those internal investments so that you can extend the life of those resources and keep using them longer without having to reinvest capital.
That's right, and instead of having to constantly upgrade your private cloud resources for scalability, and whether that's scale up or scale out, leveraging the public cloud in Windows Azure allows you access to do these things without a large upfront investment.
Up next, we have the hybrid apps, and what do you want to share a little bit about hybrid apps with the people listening at home?
Oh, definitely. Every company that I've been involved with has always had a series of pieces of data and apps that they've already developed inside and a set of resources that they've already committed to, whether that's database, whether that's people's time to develop this application. Hybrid apps are a way of allowing us to think about that stuff in a smaller segment where we can break pieces apart and move pieces around that make sense. Take, for example, I have an old website or an old database that's been running the company for years. Well, somebody's come up with a brilliant new idea on let's put a new front end on this and let's make it available to a new client segment. I could build a quick application that we put out into Azure, into the public cloud where everybody can get a hold of it, that then has very strict controls back into my organization and back into that private data. For all those wonderful managers out there that like to have staged releases, this is hybrid apps is one of those steps to a stage. Everybody complains about how hard it is to get data in and out of their ERP system. SAP in the last few years has basically come out with a new set of web connectors that helps move them forward in being able to connect their data to the rest of the organization that has purchased SAP. Well, with the cloud and particularly the service bus, I can go ahead and start building layers around our ERP so we have the proper controls in place, and then start exposing bits and pieces to make it more manageable, easier to get to, being able to focus data on a particular client's needs. This is one of my favorites. I've got a couple of companies that have lots of internal apps, and they turn out to be a lot of Access databases, Excel spreadsheets, 3 or 4 one-off databases in SQL. We need to pull this data together. SQL Azure gives me a convenient place to pull the highlighted data together, aggregate things together, and feed it back to other apps. We can even flip this one on its head and say, maybe it makes sense for my data to live in the cloud, and then all my on-prem apps, desktop apps for all you people out there, can connect out to that shared resource in the cloud. More manageability, more security.
This is also a great approach for if you have multiple disparate locations. Let's say you have employees all around the country and you need to get this app into their hands, or this app is a mobile app and it's not running on a desktop. In this case, where you have multiple geographic locations, rather than locking your SQL database into a physical structure, you can put it in the cloud and let the apps then be free-ranging all over your organization.
Well, Brian, you know a way to steal a guy's thunder. And basically our next slide shows that type of concept, but it also shows a wonderful way of taking the data from multiple apps, aggregating it together, and then running a series of additional scripts, data transformations to it, and bringing that back into the organization inside our data warehouse, allowing the BI folks to really dig in and take our data to new levels. This is another one of my personal favorites. This is what I always affectionately term the pizza example. Every year there's pizza. There's 5 big days that pizza is sold continuously. And we built data centers based upon this high load. Well, does it really make sense? in a burstable front end like this, when we have a time of ramp up, we can then push out that front end to the cloud, allow it to work, and then eventually turn around and bring it back in if that makes any sense. Another personal favorite, and I'm one of these guys that love the things in the back end. I view APIs as my own web app. So the idea of being able to put a worker role in the cloud to process data, whether that's data internally or data that I have collected from other places, being able to turn around, process it, transform it, build it, give it better business value. And all of this leads me over to the first steps to building an interesting disaster recovery plan and business continuity. With Azure, I can look at ways of putting database into the cloud so that my data is always there, always available. I can put apps into the cloud so that they're always there, always available. And then being able to have that data sync back to my location so I always have one extra copy. And every security and data guy I know loves to have one extra copy.
That's actually a really common thing that we see here at Oakwood. Our customers that are working with applications on-prem, they haven't really jumped into Azure yet and are just kind of getting a feel for it. One of the first places we look are at those existing applications that have a SQL Server backend of some sort and are really mission critical to business. For rather low cost, you can stand up SQL Azure in the cloud or even SQL Server running on an IaaS server. And there's multiple different ways of utilizing this particular approach, but getting that data out of the on-prem application and into the cloud in a secure lockdown capacity that can only be accessed through your data center gives you a strong, reliable disaster recovery approach that you can restore your apps from later.
And all of this can basically be summed up in that the cloud, both the public and the private cloud, allows me to increase my capabilities, have infinite scalability, well, okay, within reason of my credit card, and have a level of reliability that I've never seen before, and be able to extend and have durability across my application stack. One data center inside my company, it crashes, I'm SOL. Microsoft's data centers don't crash as a general rule, and they've got multiple data centers, so that load's spread wide.
So adding your 3 nines and 4 nines of SLA stability is really a big lift.
At pennies a minute.
So just a quick recap here. They've covered a lot of scenarios where we go back and forth between moving compute and data on and off the private and public clouds. There are various different scenarios here where we can use the public cloud and the private cloud in unique mixtures like these to take the best advantage of those hybrid applications. And the list could go on and on and on. These are just scenarios that we've implemented in the last, what, probably 60 days with?
Forms of it, yes, but we've been doing this type of stuff for the last year, and some of the previous stuff that was in place last year we've been using to do similar concepts.
Absolutely. So moving on to the next step, we've looked at the basic data center expansion. We've looked at hybrid apps. Both of these are focused on getting your data center to the next level using these public cloud resources. But the biggest question that was always asked since CTP was launched was about security and governance. How do we manage all these servers? So up next, we're going to have Nathan cover taking that data center or that hybrid cloud app and injecting security, governance, and virtual network.
Thanks, Brian. When you're looking at some of the security, governance, and virtual networking solutions between clouds, and that's the public cloud and Windows Azure, again, I've mentioned that you can leverage some of your on-premise virtual server infrastructure and utilize System Center to automate and spin up some of these VMs in the public cloud. But let's take a look at what that actually looks like when you're enabling connections across premises. So let's take a look at the Azure virtual networking space. So you can actually build a virtual network connection, which is similar to a site-to-site VPN connection between the private cloud and public cloud. And you can leverage solutions from right now supported solutions from Cisco, Juniper, and brand new with the general availability of the infrastructure as a service component of Windows Azure, Windows Server 2012 remote routing and remote access is now also supported when building these cross-premise connectivities.
So that's a really recent change.
Yes, yes, about within the past 2 weeks.
Nice.
So when leveraging some of the identity and access solutions that Windows Azure offers, some of these scenarios are pretty flexible. One of the ways you can leverage identity and access in Windows Azure is deploying Active Directory within Azure, and typically this is done with a completely separate forest or identity infrastructure, such as Windows Azure Active Directory. You can also leverage ACS and federate identities between identity providers, and this could be your private cloud on-premise or your public cloud in Azure. You can also use third-party identity providers such as Google or Microsoft's Live ID or even Facebook. And also, one of the ways, if you're deploying workloads in the public cloud that also need to leverage identity infrastructure in your private cloud, you can also deploy domain controllers with on-premise connectivity so that you're providing identity solutions to those VMs and workloads that you're deploying in the public cloud.
Nathan, did I just understand that right, that I can basically take my current AD and then expose a segment of it to the cloud and allow my customers, clients to sign into that, and I'm not polluting my internal AD with their credentials? I'm keeping them separated, but still having a boundary that we can cross as we need to?
And that's absolutely correct. And it really depends on the deployment model and any sort of regulatory compliance that you need to meet. Usually if you're deploying solutions in the public cloud that are only going to be leveraged by, or leveraged in the case of data center expansion, you would leverage your on-premise Active Directory and identity infrastructure. But if you're building completely separate solutions that only need to federate or have their own independent identity solutions, you can do that also within Windows Azure.
Very cool. Thank you.
And also, really this enables you to choose the point of entry for your user. So let's say that your user has a provisioned identity currently in a system, and maybe the system is hosted on-premise. That allows you to leverage that identity infrastructure and Active Directory and enable those users to log into these public cloud solutions. It also allows them to have access to federated identity. So let's say that you're trusting something like Google or Facebook for providing claims for a user's identity. You can allow Facebook users to access the solutions utilizing their Facebook logins and identities. You can also allow them to, let's say that it's a user within your own infrastructure. You can also leverage that identity that is currently running on-premise in Windows Azure through a deployed domain controller. Microsoft's, for those of you out there that are wondering how you deploy a domain controller in Windows Azure and why you would do such a thing, typically Microsoft's guidance on this is to deploy a read-only domain controller, and this gives those solutions running in Windows Azure access to a local directory.
So a few points I'm seeing on the slide. Instead of a persistent VM in the public cloud, we could use this with our PaaS deployment as well, couldn't we?
Absolutely.
And then the second observation here is if we're using virtual networks, that's a network level communication. So our apps don't change and our servers don't change. We can move those VMs back and forth so the operating systems and the workloads on them don't change. If we're using the on-prem domain controllers or even AD in Azure, security doesn't change. So realistically, we're talking about minor networking configuration changes here to enable all these different pieces.
So I could write a PowerShell script that would take servers inside my company and move them out to the cloud in what? The connection speed that I have?
Yep, only limited by the connection speed between your public and private clouds, and that's a fully supported solution currently. When you're looking at provisioning networks across the private cloud and public cloud, really it's best to think of Windows Azure as a completely separate site. It really is an expansion of your data center. Let's say that all of a sudden you need a flexible, scalable data center and you need it tomorrow. Well, Windows Azure provides you that solution.
So basically, if we wanted to adopt every principle here, the only thing that would cause a change is if we decided to expand our governance model by allowing external users to participate in an application the same way an AD user would. And in that case, all we're doing is incorporating this new level of functionality into our app to determine the difference between an authenticated AD user and an external user, which we'd have to do that anyway.
Right.
And from a business point of view, or from my chief financial officer's point of view, this changes how they pay for things. This changes how I can predict what my expenses are and keep a better control and oversight of those expenses.
That's right. And when leveraging a completely separate identity infrastructure that's provided by Windows Azure, it also natively allows you to give access to what is called Windows Azure ACS and the ability to federate that identity without deploying, an expensive or complicated identity solution in your on-premise environment.
That's great to hear. So just quick recap, the security and governance and the virtualized network between your different clouds is a fairly simplistic network configuration that enables these advanced features on any of your VM-based IaaS apps or your custom-built SaaS applications. So pretty simplistic approach. So up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the app dev side for app dev listeners out there. And Wick's going to fill you in on some of the new app dev services that were added to the stack.
This is one that just changes, it seems like, every 30 days. I have read over the last 3 months about new changes in the mobile offerings, the media offerings, and the website offerings that Microsoft's been giving us. So we all start with the same standard point. We have things inside our network that we want to have, and we need to get others to access them, whether that's a service or internal APIs, data, lots and lots of data spread all across the place. And some of us are even fortunate enough to have various pieces of media, webinars, MP3s. I know several HR departments that have pictures of every single person, and they also have their entire training manual in some type of video presentation. If there was a way to be able to expose this to the world, or, well, to my employees in a meaningful way, that could save us a lot of time and trouble. And wouldn't you know it, Microsoft comes to the rescue. The Service Bus. This is a great tool for allowing us to have better control, governance of our existing services, of new services. It allows us to help bring on new services. And I am talking about services from a WCF point of view or a JSON point of view, where I have newer versions of my API that needs to get out to the world or out to my applications. And managing 3 to 5 different versions of my API gets rather cumbersome. Service Bus gives me a way of being able to dig into that, control it, govern it, and move on with it. Data. We're always dealing with data. I have got BI guys that are just excited about seeing some of the stuff that's going on in reporting because they get to use their standard tool set, SSRS, their standard tools for the way they like to be able to deal with data and how they like to report on it. But Azure gives us the ability to expose it in far better ways. We can now sync data across multiple systems. We can have a better reliability of that syncing across systems, across facilities if needed. Being able to turn around and report on this new set of data that now encompasses a bigger world. And Microsoft Media Services. This is a way of being able to put up my content, have it in multiple formats that are readily consumable through the web. Microsoft gives us some encoding services that appear to be very, very interesting. So as you can see from a very high level, we get ways to safely expose our content and our services. We get better ways to manage, report, and stream that content around. And all of this, in this case, is just pointing back to Windows Mobile Services and websites. But you don't have to limit yourself there. This could be any type of app that Microsoft in the cloud supports. Mobile services, in the last year, we have seen them release the first version of this for Windows 8 phones. Since then, they have a downloadable template of a runnable app for Android, iOS, Windows 8, and it just continues to build. There is a simple SQL Azure database behind the scenes that's part of the service, and I can basically have a simplistic site up in about 2 hours.
Yeah, it's a really amazing point, Wick. When you look at these mobile services, Microsoft's invested a lot here in this concept of a backend as a service. Being able to simply define a data schema that you want to communicate to your employees, your partners, and your customers, and then, like Wick said, you get a template. But it's not just a template, it's actually really a functional app. That schema is wrapped up, it's put into an iOS app that you have the source for, a Java app that you have the source for, and a Windows 7 and Windows 8 app that you have the source for. So you basically download the project, and don't confuse it. This is an ugly, nasty little project. It's not pretty, but it starts out with all the functionality, all the piping, all the plumbing. If you've worked in Service Bus, you now have a notification hub that can do push notifications to the devices. If you've chosen to secure that application and require logins, it ties into the ACS solution we talked about before, and now you have security and authentication built into your application. And all this is downloaded. So right off the bat, after defining your data schema, you have your solution. You just have to make it pretty in Azure workflows. And since it's in SQL Azure, the one little line here between the data sync and the mobile services, or the data sync and the web, means that you can take that defined data schema, use data sync, and pull that back down into your BI solution. So within a day of starting your application development, you're pumping data back into your BI source that you can use to create better reports and re-disseminate that via the mobile device or the website, along with your media content and all of your existing services. Very, very powerful tool sets.
I've been digging through the mobile services a little bit, and it's been a great learning experience. I now have a far better appreciation for developing a mobile app that is scalable, that is ready to use into the cloud, that has a high level of security. These are not all easy things to do on their own, but here's a container that's got it wrapped. It shows me some guidance on how can I start developing this and moving us down the path. One of the things I'm excited about is the websites. From a simplistic point of view, in 15 minutes, I can have a Hello World app, well, a Hello World website up and running, nothing connected to it in the back end. And then from there, begin exploring out into other areas that make sense for that app. One of the things that we do around here all the time is, hey, we have this great idea. We throw it together into a website. We throw it up into the Azure websites. And now we go over to our marketing folks and say, hey, what do you think? Tell me what you like. Tell me what you hate. We can take it to our managers and say, what do you like? What do you hate? And they can go back to us and say, I don't like this color. I don't like this logo. The things that they need is right there in front of them. We have a very convenient, fast way, and I didn't have to go over to my infrastructure guys and say, hey, can I get a login to this particular server so I can throw this up? So it will only last 2 days.
You know, that actually brings up a great story. What's that tool set that you guys recently launched, MMS?
Admin Anywhere for System Center.
Great, Admin Anywhere. You know, that was a wonderful story. The marketing team and Wick and a few others have been working for months feverishly to build this application. And it was time to launch the app. We had minutes before MMS to get it out there and into the market. And because of the speed of those websites, we were able to take the marketing website for that application and deploy it literally in minutes, so that when we got to MMS, the team was ready to go and ready to talk about the application.
The two hardest points for that from a technical point of view was coming up with waiting for the DNS servers in the background through our various registers to sync up. Mm-hmm. And the other one was just getting people to agree that, hey, this is the site we want to go with. We had a couple of competing internal sites.
That's always the hard part. And what's that URL? Because I see we have a lot of System Center users in the attendee list here.
Systemcentertogo.com.
Wonderful. So for those of you who want to access pieces of your System Center implementation via your mobile device, definitely check out that website. It may be of great interest to you going forward. So up next, we're going to dig into our next area of coverage, and that actually ties in well because we're talking about System Center. And I promise that was sheerly a coincidence. So looking at single pane of glass, we're going to have Nathan Reynolds talk about System Center and how it interacts with the cloud.
Thanks. Yes, that was a great segue. So I've mentioned a couple of times using System Center to manage and automate the resources that you're deploying in the public cloud. And really, I cannot spend enough time on this. This is a huge addition in System Center 2012 SP1. And it really does give you a single pane of glass. You're leveraging all of the same tools that you use today to manage your on-premise resources and monitor your on-premise resources, and extends those to the public cloud. So we're going to step through a few use cases here when utilizing these various System Center components and how they're leveraged in the public cloud. So here we have using burst and live migration with Hyper-V, or really any virtualization infrastructure. It could be VMware, and System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And basically, after building a connection between your on-premise data center and your Windows Azure Virtual Network, you're then able to deploy VMs or migrate VMs across the public cloud. And these can be very much on demand, and we'll take a look at some of the other System Center components that you would use for that. But it makes it just within a few clicks to be able to either migrate an on-premise virtual machine to the public cloud, or start spinning up other virtual machines based on image sets that are currently deployed in your on-premise environment in the public cloud.
So one quick question on that, Nathan. I've heard a lot of talk about this live migration shared nothing. Is that the right term for that?
It is, and VMM allows you to do the live migration and the shared nothing migration in your on-premise resources. And it can also greatly reduce any associated downtime or any sort of migration time associated with moving virtual machines between data centers. All right, so now let's look at the automated bursting capability. And for this, we use things like System Center Orchestrator, lovingly nicknamed Scorch, and System Center App Controller. And what those allow you to do is with System Center Orchestrator, you can actually automate a lot of your data center tasks, both your on-premise tasks, as in deploying VMs or standardizing on service models that you're built in something like System Center Service Manager, and offer these services in a way that is standardized and the same each and every time. And you can use App Controller to, you can leverage Orchestrator and use App Controller when deploying workloads to your on-premise data center or your public cloud.
So one of the things we've seen that really valuable is we have one customer that has gotten really fancy with Scorch utilization, and they've built some routines that can actually monitor the usage of the system, utilization of internal resources, and when they see that something's being overutilized, Scorch automatically kicks in thanks to an integration with OpsMan, takes that packaged workload, automatically deploys it to the cloud, sends a signal out to their F5 so that it can actually start diversifying that traffic between the on-prem resources and the cloud resources. You can also just do a DNS change and automatically reroute them, but all that through simplistic PowerShell scripts that's contained in one workbook that we execute on an automated bursting pattern.
Absolutely. An Orchestrator is extremely flexible, both in your on-premise data centers through the use of integration packs offered by third parties. So many of your third-party applications and server products that you're using today, like as Brian mentioned, F5, are offered extensibility through these integration packs, and that includes Windows Azure.
I really wish I had this when I was working for the pharmaceutical company. There was times where we needed new resources now, and nobody wanted to spend the money because it would take months to get it.
Yep, and now it's just as easy as a few clicks, or if you have it fully automated with Orchestrator and Operations Manager, it happens automatically, and that's both provisioning and deprovisioning.
Well, one thing we don't show here is that another piece of that process could be integration with TFS even. Having your nightly builds automated so that they just dump into part of Sport's routine. So not only can you use this for bursting, but you could use the same approach for managing your continuous integration or other pieces of your deployment path.
That's right. So now let's take a look at some of the configuration, the ability to leverage Configuration Manager in Azure. So with the addition of Configuration Manager 2012 SB1, Microsoft has introduced the ability to use Azure distribution points. And what this is that you can actually leverage Azure in your software distribution model and deploy your software packages out to Azure so that your end users aren't constantly coming back to your on-premise data center and saturating any sort of internet connectivity that you have at your on-premise data center.
Yeah, this is really great for people that have large disparate networks or people around the world that you need to get patching out to. If you've got one pipe coming into your office, do you give it up to push out a bunch of upgrades or other pieces of configuration? Or do you push it out one time to the Azure DP and let your customers externally access it all through Azure and let Microsoft bear the burden of the pipe?
That's right. And as Brian mentioned there, it is geographically distributed. So if you have, say, a lot of Configuration Manager clients running in Asia, you're easily able to add an Azure distribution point that services the Asia region locally and then deploy your software packages to those users through something that's geographically much closer to them.
The one thing to keep in mind with this approach is that inside of Azure you do have to pay for outbound bandwidth consumption. So making sure that you understand the cost difference between downloading those patches from your DP versus downloading them internally through your own pipe is a very important consideration.
That's right.
We can set Azure up to chase the sun.
That's right. That's right. You can easily deploy your software packages around the world and meet those deadlines for package deployment very easily with Azure. So now let's take a look at some of the backup solutions. And this is something that is offered through System Center Data Protection Manager. Also with the release of Windows Azure Infrastructure as a Service, they've also introduced a backup client that you can download from the management portal and install on your local servers. And that basically gives the ability to leverage Azure storage and these storage blobs as a backup space for your on-premise server solution. So you can take these virtual machines or other data that you could back up on-premise today and actually back those up to geographically distributed drive space in Windows Azure.
That's cool.
It is very cool, very cool. It takes away the need of those, the constant storage complaint of having to add new storage constantly based on your workload. Now, you just deploy it to, or back it up to Windows Azure, and the need to add storage for backup practically disappears.
Well, and from a cost perspective, that's probably the greatest single win inside of Azure. Drive space is currently under $1,000 per terabyte per year, so that's cheaper than you can really manage that same drive space internally. So if you can simply carve out all of that extra cold data that no one's ever going to use and get it out of your infrastructure, you've just, doubled, quadrupled the lifespan of a SAN solution, so you don't have to reinvest another $250,000 to get drive space back?
That's right.
So the Chicago office can have all the space that they need, while the guys that we have out in Taiwan that only need a small segment just use their small portion.
That's right. Yeah. So I talked a little bit about some of the authentication options when leveraging Azure. So, and this includes the ability to leverage your on-premise domain controller and the ability to leverage access control in Windows Azure to federate those identity solutions. So this is just a touch on that you use a lot of the same utilities that you're using today to manage that identity and access control that expands across the board into Windows Azure as well.
This is the one that kind of scares me a little bit. I trust AD, and I trust a lot of things around it, but I'm not sure that some of my managers are going to trust Facebook.
Well, again, that's part of the flexibility of Azure is it allows you to leverage your on-premise connectivity only. You don't have to federate those on-premise resources to any third-party providers. We can keep everything in-house if we want to, or if we want to federate with third parties, Windows Azure makes it a very easy operation to do, and you don't have to, deploy this complicated federation infrastructure in your on-premise.
And one great point to add here is that when we talk about AD and access control, ACS is turned off by default. So even if you federate your AD out to Azure AD, that doesn't mean that Facebook's automatically granted in. So you could build out a staged rollout of security based on what you wanted to grant to different resources. And maybe you only have one Azure account that has Facebook authentication or third-party OAuth authentication, and keep that segmented. But in other ones, maybe you just do the AD federation, or maybe if you have a partner account, you set up resources that your partner should be able to access, and you federate both your AD and theirs. And now you have that central governance, and you don't have to open that hole to risk.
Given me time to build the confidence inside my manager and my security officer that, hey, this is an acceptable way to do business.
That's right. And also, with Windows Azure, I've mentioned using System Center Service Manager and the ability to leverage System Center Orchestrator to standardize on those service requests. So your users could go to a portal, a service portal, in your on-premise environment, issue a request, and then that request gets processed by Orchestrator. If that needs to be, say, a virtual machine deployment in your on-premise data center, or if there's no more capacity in your on-premise data center, we need to scale that out to the public cloud. Leveraging Service Manager as part of these components makes those automating those requests very easy.
And one great thing to add here is that you don't just have to integrate ServiceMan to get some of those capabilities. If you look at the ServiceNow integration pack, you could tie that into ServiceMan, give the same self-service capabilities, but still build the backbone of the actual self-service implementation on Scorch or some other approach.
That's right. There are third-party integration packs available through System Center Orchestrator, and so you don't have to use Microsoft Service Manager software. And also monitoring. This is another very powerful aspect of using this single pane of glass. So when using System Center Operations Manager, we can deploy monitoring agents to our virtual machines, whether those are on-premise or in the cloud, and monitor those just as you're monitoring those today. We can also monitor the Windows Azure Fabric to determine any sorts of service outages or downtime or any other potential alerts that we need to take a look at. There have traditionally been some problems with managing certificate life cycles and certificate lifetimes within Windows Azure. So part of the monitoring packs or management packs offered for Windows Azure very much monitor the lifetime of those management certificates. And also we have the ability to do application performance monitoring, and that's both with SQL Azure and any applications that we leverage across the cloud. So if you do have an application which leverages deployments both in your on-premise data center and your public cloud data center, it monitors those across the board just as it would if it were only on-premise.
And one point to add to that, when we talk about APM, that's a central piece to our app dev team. And application performance monitoring gives us that ability to see the performance of the app, see errors as they happen in real time. So sometimes we'll respond to an error before the end user even gets a chance to call in. And most importantly, it creates that integration between System Center and TFS so that you can go from operations to development and push things over like the memory stack, so that inside of the application support team, we can actually pull up that error and step through it inside our source code, fix it faster, and redeploy. But one thing to keep in mind here is APM is actually one of the first reasons why I consider going with an IaaS application development versus a PaaS. The best practice is PaaS first, according to Microsoft, and I would have to support that because of the reduced management. But currently, APM doesn't have an agent to run on a PaaS front end. So you would either have to build a startup script that installs OpsMan every time the server stands up and activates the APM management pack, or you can build one pristine image that actually has APM already pre-installed, your source code ready to go, and then launch from an IaaS front end, which is another option. And that's a faster way of getting APM integrated and monitoring your applications.
So you can see you can combine a lot of these capabilities with System Center across any sort of use case scenario when leveraging Windows Azure?
So one of the big changes we've seen this year is that Microsoft is really focused on getting away from a cloud-only mindset. We've seen that our code base can be deployed the same way that it is internally, so we can take advantage of existing code. Our workloads can be deployed so that we can take advantage of those workloads, whether they're servers or applications or anything else. So Microsoft's really locked down in that frontline area of our client layer. They started out with an approach of just making Azure available to PCs and browsers. They've now added Office add-ins, tablets, phones, really strong focus on those guys with the mobile services. You can now integrate with Office 365, making your AV in the cloud govern your Office 365 implementation. You could even deploy Exchange to Windows Azure on an IS server, and now you have those Exchange connectors that you couldn't do before with pure Office 365. You can also build SharePoint apps, put those on a PaaS implementation, and consume those via SharePoint Online, creating that integration there. You can even build game consoles. A lot of focus in that area. Games like Potterville were recently launched on Azure, and I believe even a Blizzard implementation was launched on Azure, the last I heard. So we've got the focus on our on-prem apps, services, database, etc. So a lot of focus on that client layer. Digging in a little bit deeper, the integration layer has been a big focus. As we saw, we had the virtual networks. We also have Connect for more of a point-to-point connection. We have our Service Bus and AD and ACS, which we've talked about. A large focus on the ability to deploy APIs and data sync, which is finally coming out of preview. Some other things we didn't talk about in the integration layer is CDN for the ability to do global distributed content through a content delivery network. You have the store or the add-on pieces, which is really unique because this is one of the first times I've ever really seen Microsoft dig into the open source space. So when we talk about VMs, we have our Windows VMs, but we also have Linux VMs. And then if you look at the store, we have add-ons that give us services, either app services or data services we can deploy to the cloud, and a whole collection of different VMs that we can deploy directly to the cloud. Traffic Manager for balancing load across multiple cloud implementations. And one thing we did briefly mention was the ability to manage everything we've talked about today through commandlets for PowerShell. So you can write your own PowerShell scripts to automate it. In the application layer, we've talked about websites, persistent VMs were definitely covered, mobile services, media services, etc. A few others we didn't talk much about those, the traditional web and worker roles, which still exist. And when we talk about compute, everything's wrapped in its own dedicated DNS package called a cloud service. And in the back-end as a service space, in addition to mobile and media services, we also have Hadoop services for consolidating a lot of big data. Then in our data layer, we have the traditional blobs, tables, queues, and SQL Azure databases that we've seen since the first launch. We now add in reporting, which we've talked about. And we briefly touched on drives, but when we talk about drives, this is really a modified version of blobs that we can treat just like a regular drive. The biggest advantage is now they're all geo-synced or geo-replicated, so we can spread those drives over multiple geographic areas. And in the SQL Azure space, we've added Stream Insight, which adds the ability to consolidate large volumes of small packets of data into that BI solution. Mix that with your unstructured data from Hadoop and your structured data from SQL Azure, and you have a very robust BI solution. And finally, when we look at the tools area, or the other category, Nathan talked about System Center 12, SP1, Scorch, Hyper-V, and the Azure Backup, all great tool sets. A few other tools and miscellaneous pieces we didn't cover is that the portal's also in that purple area because it was ripped out, destroyed. It used to be a really crappy Silverlight implementation. Now it's a very robust, interactive HTML5 implementation. And then on top of that, they added the Trust Center, which is found on the Windows Azure site at the bottom right-hand corner if you scroll all the way down. And this is where you can see the different compliant efforts that Microsoft has taken on, becoming the only cloud player that can offer a HIPAA BAA or HIPAA compliance, in addition to EU, Safe Harbor, ISO, SSAE, and a number of other compliance efforts. Next, there were a number of new data centers added. On the edge space, I believe there were 20 data centers added in the last 12 months, and one of the ones that I've had heard the most buzz come up about is the East Asia data center. And then finally, all this was delivered by a really dynamic new team headed up by Scott Hu over on the Azure side, who have really focused on driving a lot of change in the last year. So this is our big map of what's changed. What's new? In one word, architecture. As you saw, our servers are the same. Our code, for the most part, is the same unless we're adding new features. We've made a couple of little architectural networking changes and a couple of little programming changes in our applications. The problem is that these minor changes have some pretty significant ramifications to cost, performance, capabilities, etc. So if you boil it all down, that big map spells out a big change in architecture. So this is the reason why we created our Nimbus framework, and I know that those people on the line have probably heard this a couple of times over, but this supports the real reason for this framework. We focus on delivering a cloud assessment to look at the business value, the portfolio alignment, and the basic architecture of which pieces make sense to include in your overall plan. We then follow up with a week or two of discovery, either in the cloud, the architecture technology space, or working with your app to see if it's compatible with a past deployment, maybe a DRBC piece or an IaaS piece, or even a platform discovery piece where we can look at SharePoint, SQL, and System Center in the cloud for you. And basically that all begins with the Nimbus assessment. For a small portfolio that you just want to focus on 1 to 5 business apps and figure out what tools you can implement, a 2-day process would take care of that and help you understand that architecture and how it fits. For bigger portfolios, or if you want to get into small infrastructure solutions like SQL or SharePoint, a 5-day engagement helps us understand where you're going, what you're trying to do, and look at that big map to see which pieces are going to give you lift. And finally, the 9 days for those larger portfolios of 10 or more apps, a complex DRBC solution, or one of your more complex infrastructure solutions. So these are all options available that make it a very low investment to look into that big stack of what's new, what's coming, and what's changed, and figure out how it implements your architecture. Oh, and our contact info is on the screen if you want to get a hold. And you guys have a wonderful day, and welcome to the world of Azure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.